All right. Be released. Okay. Now, this has been an amazing gathering. I'm sorry we're not in person because I'm sure during the breaks, the conversation could have been even more stimulating than what it's been already. But since I started out each session with a bit of centering, I'm going to do it for this one. Maybe I should do it even more for this one than the other ones because we're going to deal with some practicalities, some of the specifics that Archbishop Wester was talking about. So we'll see how it goes. So let's get yourself situated. I'm standing because I need to keep my energy up, but situate yourself, get balanced. We'll do 3 big breaths again. First, the first big breath, let's let go of all the stuff we did during the break. All right, breathe in and then let it out and bring yourself present. Ignore the phone, ignore the messages, ignore the comments. We're here. On the second breath in, let's take in gratitude for the richness of this time together. Just gratitude that we could be so stirred up. So just breathe in gratitude and breathe out that blessing to our troubled world. And finally, let's breathe in curiosity to answer the questions, so what? Let's just breathe it in and breathe it out. So you ready? You're settled? Good. I know I'm better for it. Well, this has been really a fascinating conference. And I realized this morning during my meditation how these talks kind of went together in an interesting way. I thought it was really important for those who could make Carol Zinn's a day of reflection piece. It was really important to think about evolutionary movement, the fact that it's slow, that we don't arrive, as well as this idea is the distinction between change and transformation. And isn't some of that the wrestling that we've been doing with Archbishop Wester's talk about how we preach? I use the royal we, how you preach. Um, Ironically, I preach in non-Catholic settings, but I feel your pain for that reason. Um, the But the important piece is how we move to that sense of transformation in Christ, the promise of being embraced by the Spirit, enlivened by the Spirit. And then John Carr's presentation, looking really at faithful citizenship and quite frankly at the complexity of these some of narrow life issues. Now, I must say, John's raising up of abortion, euthanasia, and death penalty, I think were all pretty important, pretty central. But his idea of politically homeless is not my experience. I'm not really going to talk about that, but I don't think you have to be a political nomad. In fact, I think there's some reasons why you shouldn't be, because we have missionary work to do wherever we are. But apart from that, I thought he really grounded us in faithful citizenship. And then Sister Carol's very different, very contrasting presentation, but about the same nugget of the gospel alive in our world, and where she talks about that the measure was how it impacts the poor. That's the measure. And I don't know about you, but I felt quite a difference between Georgetown, I'll call him Georgetown John, how John was connected to the academic concern, and Sister Carol is connected to the experience of the people, a daughter of charity. And then we have Archbishop Wester's challenge to us to get into specifics when it comes to preaching. I found the story of the Marian old priest kind of disturbing. I have had that experience almost. I was down in Atlanta, Georgia, and somebody gave me what for in the middle of my talk. But It is disconcerting, but yet on the other hand, isn't that what Jesus experienced too? Huh. How do we deal with that? And Archbishop Wester also brought up that whole idea that proclamation is not just the words we say, it's who we are and what we do. And that biblical justice, a right relationship, is so much more than the checklist approach that was used back in pre-Vatican II times, and sometimes is used now. Well, my role is to take all that, shuffle the deck, and try to talk about some practical action that you can take in this election cycle. As you may or may not know, I work at Network, Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. I have the honor of having written the Nuns Letter, which helped get the Affordable Care Act passed. Sister Carol did the fabulous work of getting Catholic Health Association, and all we did was affirm Catholic Health Association's stance. The thing that happened in between was the bishops' conference saying they didn't agree, and they wanted to defeat the ACA. But it was a gift of the Spirit, and I really thought for me it was a nunc dimittis moment, that if I never did another good thing, I had done something really significant to get around 22 million people more healthcare in our nation. But the thing that I've come to know in this process is that we all have a part to play. And knowing that we all have a part to play is critical then in our discernment of what is our part now. And just because when I was a young sister, I had one part does not mean that it's the same part that I have now. It changes over time. And some of you have heard me say this, but I've realized as I've prayed over what is my part in the body of Christ, it came to me in prayer that, oh, my part right now is being stomach acid in the body of Christ. Now, the good news is it can liberate energy. It can stir people up. It can get people engaged. But I can be toxic in large quantities. I have to be contained in a small bus. And I do need somebody to pick up this energy and do something with it. Because if we don't work together, my energy that I release is not for anything. So what's your part? That's what I want you to spend some time mulling as you think about this time together. And also as we go through my little talk of what to be mindful of. So hopefully I can give you some practical actions. Now I will say I have a PowerPoint, but I'm not so good at doing that and Zoom. So what I'm going to do is I'll share the PowerPoint with you all. I'll send it to the organizers and we'll send it out to everybody. So some of the names, if you don't get all the details, no te preocupes, está bien. Don't worry, it'll be fine. I'll send you the PowerPoint and you'll have the basics, okay? So I want to start by talking about the context that we're in. And I think some of this anti-racism piece that we've got to pick up and engage. And especially talking to folks who, like I, walk in white skin, is we have a lot of work to do. The issue of racism, quite frankly, is a white issue. It's our problem that we need to change. And I want to lift up the fact that we have racism within the church. And part of the pushback against Archbishop Gregory for calling out the John Paul II Center, where President Trump went to the center for this photo op, literally a photo op. He said nary a word. There, what I realized was a piece of the truth that our white privilege allowed that to happen. And Father Brian Massengale recently had an article in America, and I'm sure you probably followed Father Brian, but his analysis is critically important for us as a church. to heal some of the racism. I grew up in Southern California, and for us growing up, the church was English and Spanish speaking. It was just my experience. I was Southern California. But what I didn't realize till I came back east was that there were Black churches and white churches, that there was segregation in the church itself, that Black Catholics often feel dismissed and pushed out. One of our staff finds herself often on the fringes of Catholic life because, oh, you couldn't really be Catholic, you're Black. The Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans, African American community, they continue to wear a modified habit. And I got to be at their, facilitate their chapter. It was one of the dearest things ever. But they told me the reason they do that is people don't believe they're sisters. Well, you're Black, you couldn't be a sister. That's a sin of our past. It's a sin of the church. It's a sin that we have to admit and change. Okay? Church. I don't do church politics, but that's church. I had to mention it. But in the civil sector, we really have to be aware of this Black Lives Matter movement. This moment is critical. We have an opportunity. And for us white folks, I would highly recommend reading Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. She makes abundantly clear in the book that too often white folks make racism about, did I say something wrong? Was I impolite? Did I use the wrong word? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend. And when we do that in relationship, what happens is it makes it about us. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I feel so bad. Oh, let me cry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Whereas what we've got to see is that racism is a structural racism. The structures of our country have created the income and wealth gap in our nation, the racial income and wealth gap in our nation. We've been studying this at Network a lot. And when I found out that after the Civil War, white plantation owners in the Confederacy were paid money for each of the slaves that they had lost for the property they had lost through emancipation. White owners got money, a big sum of money for that time. But the African American former slaves got the promise of 40 acres and a mule that was rapidly withdrawn, and hardly anybody ever got that. So what I came to realize was that the wealth of the South post-Civil War was built by this buyout of plantation owners. And the poverty of freed slaves was created by our failure to reimburse them for lost wages. For me, that began me on a journey to discover what else was going on that I didn't know about. And so at Network, we've created 2 resources that'll be in the what do you call it, PowerPoint. And the first one is Network's Recommit to Racial Justice. Some of you may have used it. We created it for Lent, but we've redone it so that it's what we call evergreen. You can use it anytime, but it's for either small group or individual study about recommitting to racial justice. And the second piece is an interactive experience that we call the Racial Wealth and Income Gap. It's sort of like a game, and you can play it in groups of 4. And we're about to launch it online so we can host online versions of it, so that maybe some of your congregation, if they're working on the issue of anti-racism, what it explores is 12 laws passed by Congress that created the racial wealth and income gap. The first one is this buying out the white plantation owners and leaving the African Americans up, with nothing. But then there's 11 others that you really need to be aware of. For me, it was a really powerful change in moving from what Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility talks about, my fragility, oh, I didn't mean to offend, to touch my anger and my rage, to say, yes, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. And we need to stand together to ensure that that's the reality. Got it? Okay. The second issue I want to lift up is the issue of voting. And so often we think that our work on elections or around this time is partisanship and we don't want to deal with anything. Let me tell you that right now there are serious threats to the capacity of our people to vote. Serious threats. We've seen some of the disaster in Georgia. Yesterday in Kentucky seemed to go some better, though some counties had terrible experiences. At least Louisville and Lexington seemed to have an okay experience. But what's happening is that one party has decided that if people don't vote, if people who have a hard time voting are more likely to be in the other party, therefore we want to suppress the vote. This is about making democracy a game, not the sacred art of governance. And I think one of the places where we can speak clearly is about valuing Catholic social teaching, the dignity of each person, that if each person has dignity, then every person should be able to exercise their vote in our democracy. That's one topic for a sermon that I think you could use. And I think it'd be really tough to fight against it. The second piece I want to lift up is not everybody is wired to politics the way I would bet most of us are. And let me tell you a story of a young woman that I met in 2016 in Indianapolis. And I was doing a voter education piece like we always do every election cycle. And I was with about 25 students in a GED class, adults getting their high school equivalency. And so I got them talking about what they cared about. And these adults in their GED class cared about wages and the cost of housing. And they were having a terrible time with gentrification in Indianapolis. And it was pushing them out of their housing and they couldn't, having trouble getting to work. And there were all these problems. And so it was about 25 folks, got them talking. And then our organization had compared the positions of Clinton and Trump on the issues, on several issues, but on the issues of housing and on wages. Trump says this, Secretary Clinton says this. And then it ended with me saying, so you decide, who's best for our nation? Who will you vote for on, November 7th? Well, after this conversation in this class, showing two 90-second videos side by side, this mom of two, Thomasina, blurts out, oh, now I can vote. I wasn't going to vote. I was afraid I would hurt our country. I was like, what? You were afraid you would hurt our country? What do you mean? And what she told me was that she only saw the negative ads on TV and didn't know how to choose between these candidates that were so bad. And she was afraid she would choose wrong. So for her, the moral choice was to not vote because she didn't want to hurt our country. That broke my heart. But it also made me realize that two 90-second videos that just compared positions from a trusted messenger helped people get clarity about helped Thomasina get clarity enough to vote. And it made me think as I was preparing this talk, is that you all have that capacity too. You don't have to take a position. You have to raise an issue and compare the candidates. And then let people decide. But you also have to have taught your people what values we hold on to as Catholics. What Pope Francis is teaching. We'll talk about this in a minute. Okay, but see how that is? Well, you don't have to take a position. So you decide who's best for our nation. Who will you vote for on November 3rd? See how that works? Okay. So I think there are many more Thomasinas in our congregations than we could imagine. I'm so wired into politics, I could not imagine Thomasina's reality. And isn't that the conversion moment where we get pulled out of our world, plopped into another, and our eyes are open? I felt like the scales fell from my eyes. And my prayer always is, Lord, that I may see, Lord, that I may see. Oh, I didn't even know I was blind. That's what we've got to do in this election. We have to find ways that we can see the realities, the differences, the engagement, and hold up mirrors so that people can know how to vote. Additionally, you also should know that Network has an election toolkit which can help with some of this. It's positions, it's how to talk to candidates. We've got all kinds of resources for you to be able to support. But I also want to talk about priesthood. I have a hunch most of the people in the association spend a lot of time kind of stepping back from power. Oh, we're one among, I'm a shepherd. I'm with the sheep. I smell like a sheep. You can tell that. I share that. I get that. I totally get that. But I also want you to know that in civil society, you carry a power. And on this voting issue, on this making sure that everybody can exercise their human dignity, is that you've got a power that you can use, like with your Secretary of State in each state, to make sure that they're not suppressing the vote. If we've got any folks from Georgia, you got missionary work to do. Kansas, some missionary work. I mean, you got a number of missionary places. Let's just be real. But you could also do missionary work with county officials. How's our county? And you don't have to be questioning. You don't have to be argumentative. You can just ask the question: how are we set for the coming November election? My community is really concerned that we want to make sure every vote gets counted. Can we have a meeting? Can we talk? Quite frankly, I was the head of my religious community for 5 glorious years, most difficult job in my life. But the thing I didn't realize was that in the external world, that carried some capacity for me to speak up in some other ways for our mission. And I didn't take full advantage of that because I just plain didn't realize it. But since I've been at Network, I've come to realize y'all can do this. It'd be kind of fun to have a group of you in different states compare notes, and then you could go back to the Secretary of State or to the county folks and say, hey, over in Indiana, they're doing it this way, but in New Mexico, they're trying this. Is there something we could learn from them? Because so often, local officials, just like us in parishes, we sink into our own worlds and we don't know what else is happening. So maybe you could learn something and pass it on. Just thinking. And finally, as you come to voting, what we've got to know and acknowledge is the income and wealth disparity that is rising in our nation right now. It's been rising since about 1980, and this whole economic idea of trickle-down economics, which Pope Francis rightfully points out in Joy of the Gospel, has never, ever been proven. And in fact, experience has proven it wrong. There's no such thing as trickle down. No, it doesn't happen. So sometime get me to come back and I'll do we have to be together to do this, but our impact of the change in income over the last 36 years. But just take it from me, it's bad. And it's bad because of policy. Policies have made this happen. Now, the good news is, if policies made it happen, policies can change it. Who we elect matters. And no party is pure on this one. We've got to get them talking and committing. to mending the income and wealth gap in our nation, especially during this time of COVID. I'm certain that you all know so many people who have lost their jobs or who've been furloughed, who are struggling, who are trying to make ends meet. This is the moment to step up and step in as community. And Archbishop Wester referred to this rugged individualism. I hope this breaks open the unpatriotic lie that we're based in individualism. It's wrong. It's wrong for our faith, and it's wrong politically. It's unpatriotic. We all know the basis of our nation is not me and mine, it's we the people. So we've got to find a way where everyone thrives, including the immigrants, including those who are most marginalized in the service sector, including folks in prisons, including returning felons, including. No one can be left out of our care. You ready for that? I think you're going to have a lot to give homilies about or sermons about as we approach this election. But it's both faithful and patriotic to be communal. Got it? Cool. Okay, so now for the hot button topic of what in God's green earth do we do with this horrible, divisive, on purpose issue of how abortion is used in our politics. I was contacted by a woman that lives in my neighborhood, and she had met me at an event and knew I was a sister, and she emails me and asked, could she meet with me? And I said, oh, of course, fine, easy, yeah. And this was during lockdown, so we sat on opposite ends of the park bench, but nobody else was in the park, so it was still a private conversation. She asked to be in her 80s. And she came to me because she felt she didn't want to go to hell because as a young woman, she had had an abortion. She didn't want to go to hell. She's carried this all these years. She couldn't talk to a priest because she just felt so pushed away by males of the species. But she thought she could talk to me, though she knew I couldn't forgive her. Oh, I get tears in my eyes thinking about that. Where are we in the gospel? How are we not lifting fingers for the fine people who have struggled to do their best? Who are we that we lay such a burden on them with our righteous judgment? And I'll tell you the one that makes me most upset is that it is, and it's not your, well, I don't know if it's your fault. I won't lay blame, but the fact that the message is brought by men, often older white men, to women in judgment is excruciatingly painful. Okay, I've said my piece on that one. But now, let me confess. Bless me, brothers, for I have sinned. I realized, I recently wrote a book. It's coming out in September. It's called Hunger for Hope. You might like it. It's kind of upbeat at the end. Hard to believe, but it's true. But as I was writing this book, I realized my sin of the late 70s, early 80s, my sin was that I stayed silent on the issue of abortion. I did not want to be identified with the far right that was pretty nutty, the Phyllis Schlafly's of the time. And I stepped back. At the time I was practicing law. I had clients who came to me. I did family law mostly. But when the court appointed me to represent a 13-year-old who had been raped by her uncle and was pregnant, and I met with my client and went through her options. Here was a 13-year-old child having a child. And my attitude on abortion changed significantly. I was no longer the righteous, certain, easy to say person. No. How can you have compassion and be so certain? But my sin was I was silent. So I'm trying really hard to remedy that sin, to atone for my sin. So my atonement is this, among other things. But my atonement is this, that, the church teaches, as Pope Francis makes abundantly clear, that we need to defend the unborn. That is because of the sacredness of life. But there is no church teaching that requires the criminalization of abortion. No. Though some would want us to think that's the only response to defending the unborn. But what I know is what Sister Carol pointed out yesterday, is that after the ACA, the abortion rate went down. Do you know that until a year and a half ago, the abortion rate went down during Democratic administrations at the federal level and went up during Republican administrations? Why was that? Because Democrats provided support to pregnant women and Republicans pulled it away. We can't afford that. That's just wrong. We can't afford it. In the Affordable Care Act, what Sister Carol didn't talk about was, among the things she didn't talk about, there's a lot of gossip behind that. There was so much left unsaid. But one of the things was Senator Casey put into that bill the Pregnant Women's Support Act to test what programs help women to choose to carry their babies to term. They just finished, this June, they're finishing the 5-year study, and hopefully the reports will be out about a year from now. But what it seems to be is women having economic supports, women having access to healthcare, women having access to childcare, especially for older children. Makes all the difference. If that's the case, why don't we support it? Why do we fight against healthcare for everyone? If we're so pro-life, I think we need to step up to the plate. So my effort is to be clear about that. I'll tell you, a year and a half ago, the reason in the Trump administration that abortions have gone down for the first time since Roe v. Wade during a Republican administration, it's because of the ACA and universal access to birth control. Women are smart. Got it, guys? Just saying. Okay, now you all need to know Pope Francis's, you probably do, but I just want to make sure if you don't. Pope Francis's exhortation on holiness. But there's one part I want to lift out, paragraph 101, 102. You got to read it in context. Don't just go, proof text in it. But in context, it makes perfect sense. And what Pope Francis says there, which relates to my sin of pulling back, is he makes clear that we have to be firm and passionate in the defense of the unborn. And then he says, however, equally sacred are the lives of the already born. Equally, and then we're going to have this broader scorecard, an equally sacred scorecard, where we're going to compare the candidates based on all of the things he says we're supposed to be aware of. He says, equally sacred are those made destitute, abandoned, underprivileged. Equally sacred are the vulnerable, infirm, and the elderly exposed to covert euthanasia. I didn't really understand what he meant by covert euthanasia, but my hunch is in the United States, it's all these people dying in nursing homes because they didn't have PPE. They didn't have sufficient protective gears. It's also denying health care to low-income seniors. It's the disproportionate impact on people of color of this COVID virus. This is against the dignity of life. He then says, equally sacred are victims of human trafficking and new forms of slavery. Equally sacred are those exposed to every form of rejection. And then he says, we must address injustice in a world where some revel and others live in abject poverty. We must consider the situation of migrants a primary issue to do what Jesus asks of us, welcome the stranger. And then he says, we must oppose racism and exclusion in any form if we claim to defend the sacredness of human life. Now, one way I've thought about this is that when we get into the polarized fight, is to invite the further, don't have the fight about yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Invite the further step in. Can't we go further down the road of protecting the dignity of all life? Isn't that what we need in this time? Isn't that the antithesis to the current political climate? Oh, please, let us speak up for the fullness of our faith and our gospel. Just one thing about this strikes me now is that we speak up for the fullness of faith in the gospel, is John Carr and I were talking in the green room, and he was under the impression that I shared with him this homeless feeling of not having a political home. And I don't. And so I said, no, I don't feel that. He thought I'd been maligned by the Democratic Party. Yeah, some people in the Democratic Party. But I want to say is when you engage, then we can make our points and make a difference. In the 2012 Democratic National Convention, they asked me to address the convention in prime time. It was like shocking. It was amazing. And I said I'd do it on certain conditions. And one of them was that I could say I was pro-life and that the ACA was part of my pro-life stance. And he said, of course, of course. Actually, I think I had 3 or 4 things, I forget. They said yes so quickly. I thought I should have asked for more. But the fact is, when you engage in this conversation, we can move our values forward. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll have questions. We'll have a chance to talk about it. Okay, so that's on the life scorecard. Now, how do we know if we're on the right track? Well, I'd like to lift up the rest of Pope Francis's exhortation on holiness as being really what I've been using as my examination of conscience. It's hard to know sometimes. It's easy to get politicized. I've worked on Washington, D.C. I love you on Capitol Hill. You know, I make mischief. And I love winning. So sometimes I can get more into winning than I can into gospel. And so Pope Francis's exhortation on holiness has really been an anchor for me, and I encourage you to use it that way also. And what he says is that our examination of conscience should be the Beatitudes. No checklist, no big thing. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Are they blessed in my world? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. How do I show hunger and thirsting for justice? Blessed are those who mourn. Who do I weep with? And in, let's see, last year, oh, I don't know, in COVID lockdown, I lose track of time, but I think it was last year, I went to the border to El Paso with the American Federation of Teachers and a bunch of faith folks, and we were going to do 2 things. One, we were going to do a press conference downtown outside the federal building. And then we were going to go to Tornillo, where the kids were being held at that time that had been separated from their parents, and try to deliver some toys and books and things. And I was to speak, we were going to do a prayer thing at Tornillo. And I was going to speak at the Tornillo piece. And my job at the press conference at the center, at the detention center, or the federal building, was to be a supporter, stand there, cheer. Well, part of the reason, the reason I went to law school, more than part, the reason I went to law school was to do justice. And what struck me so powerfully there is that law was being used for injustice. And it broke my heart. And I no, I didn't have a speaking part, so I wander away. I'm in the back of the crowd. I'm crying, and I hear my name being called. And Randy Weingarten, some of you probably know Randy, but anyway, she is like a dynamo. She's the president of the American Federation of Teachers. She's calling me because she wants me to come and speak to the press. I'm weeping. Oh, great. Come, Holy Spirit. I had nothing prepared. Come, Holy Spirit is always my prayer. And you can see my pin, my community pin. We're dedicated to the Holy Spirit, Sisters of Social Service. So, good sister of social service that I am, come, Holy Spirit. And I just started to talk from my heart about how my heart was broken for the injustice being done, and I started to weep. I've never cried at a press conference. Somehow I bumbled through, I got through, got done, got off. Later, several members of the press sought me out to say that that to them was the most powerful piece that had been done. But it goes back to that, does it break our hearts? If it breaks our hearts, can we show it? Are we vulnerable enough to reveal it? Sometimes we have to be surprised with it, the way Archbishop Wester was with talking about George Floyd, but how do we bring vulnerability to our work, our ministry, our engagement? And for me, I think that using the Beatitudes as my examen becomes that part that creates more integration for me and more sense of connection and awareness. Okay, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the troublemakers. But then Pope Francis goes on and says, well, he gives 5 characteristics of holiness in the 21st century. And I love these characteristics of holiness. I never think about being holy. I just think about being faithful. Faithful to the gospel, faithful to Jesus's call. So that's my approach. But Pope Francis has got me thinking in some new ways. And Pope Francis says these 5 characteristics tell me whether or not you're on the right road. So I offer them to you as you assess your work in this election time. Use them as your touchstone to see how you're doing. And then you got a hint. If you don't measure up, you got a hint of what to do. So the first thing he says is holiness is characterized by perseverance and humility. Now, what he said, perseverance we get. You got to hang in there. You got to keep at this. It's a challenge. But humility, I was curious to know what he meant by that. And what he says is, it's the willingness to learn from others. And this is where I think the virtue that I call holy curiosity is critical for this work. Archbishop Wester talked about the certitude that we can bring to preaching. Well, but into relationship, we need to bring holy curiosity. What can I learn from you? How do I learn in this situation? Where am I open and unfinished? And quite frankly, that was a comfort to me to think, oh my gosh, is holiness partially that? So the first one he says is perseverance and humility. The second one, you can guess that I like a lot, is joy and a sense of humor. These are serious times. We could be really crazed about this. But if we're grounded in the gospel, we've got to have a modicum of joy and a sense of humor. I mean, the ironies of this age sometimes are too much. The hyper individualism of the wealth in our nation, and then the COVID virus breaks it open where we're all vulnerable. There are ways. I'm not sure that's humorous, but it brings a certain joy that the Spirit will out. The deeper truth that we belong to each other. That gives me joy. The third, Pope Francis says, is passion and boldness. Passion and boldness are what are critically required in this time. Passion in what motivates you? How are you engaged? What do you care about? How do you connect with people who have different worldviews than you? How can we enter into this time together? And boldness, should we try something new? Let's make a difference. Let's shake things up. Let's do it anew. And in this time of utter change, nothing's the same as it was. Don't hide under your desk. Don't hide in a Zoom call. Let's get engaged. Let's make it happen. Passion and boldness. And finally, no, wait a minute. The fourth one is, I've lost count. The fourth one is being in community. And that's why the association is so important. That's why your diocese is important. That's why your communities are important. We've got to do this together. Jesus didn't send out the disciples one by one. He sent them out two by two. Jesus was smart. He was a community organizer. He knew that not everybody has a good day every day. And if you have two people going together, you've got more support. You've got the possibility of being connected. And if you have an off day, somebody's going to have a good day. So that's why we have to be in community together. We are this one body. My stomach acid really means you, an engagement, right? In community, we can do this. And finally, Pope Francis says is that we need to live in constant prayer. And what I've come to realize is sometimes my prayer is just this little quiet, help, help, help. But more is learning that I'm not the measure of success. Let me just be available for the people in this moment. Let me be who you need me to be so that your message will be heard. Isn't that prayer? And isn't that Pentecost when it happens? The Pentecost prayer, the Pentecost reality wasn't that all the apostles learned so many languages. The Pentecost miracle is that people heard what they need. And so I think living in constant prayer is that prayer. May they hear may you hear what they need. Got it? Now it might feel daunting, it might feel overwhelming, it might feel like, oh my glory, she's nuts, she doesn't know the parents, she's yeah, it's true. But maybe in our conversation, in your small groups, and then later when we get a talk together, we can have more conversation. But what I want you to know is that you don't do it alone. And I wrote a poem. It's the only one of my poems that I know by heart. So I want to share it with you because I think it applies in this. Because often you can feel, at least I feel like, oh my God, I can't do this. It's too much. We've got this election on November 3rd and there's so much to do and there's all this shutdown and there's this line and there's this, there's that, there's this, there's that. Well, I was reminded as I was pondering this reality when I wrote this poem, I was thinking about the story of the loaves and fish. Remember that? It's Jesus is out in the desert and all these people followed him and the apostles say to him, send them back to town. They're going to get grumpy. There's no food out here. And Jesus says, feed them yourselves. And good old Peter, my patron, I'm Simon Peter. Good old Peter says, ooh, well, I don't know. We've just only got a couple of day-old loaves of bread and a couple of stinky fish. What's that among so many? What can we do? And Jesus must have been so frustrated. Says, all right. So he has them sit down in groups of 50, ever the community organizer. And the story goes that he blessed the loaves and fish, broke them, gave them out. Matthew's gospel says, Matthew 14, 5,000 men were fed, to say nothing of the women and children. Well, since I've already made a few comments about men were fed, you probably guessed my response. Well, I was a little miffed when I realized this, and I prayed about it. And what I realized was Matthew only counted the ones who thought it was a miracle. The women knew they brought snacks from home, and the real thing was sharing, because what woman is going to leave for the day with her family and not bring snacks? I asked. All right, with that insight, This is my poem, and it's my prayer for me and my prayer for you. And it goes like this: loaves and fish. I always joked that the miracle of loaves and fish was sharing. The women always knew this. But in this moment of need and notoriety, I ache, tremble, almost weep at folks so hungry, malnourished, faced with spiritual famine of epic proportions. My heart aches with their need. Apostle like I whine, what are we among so many? The consistent 2,000-year-old ever new response is this: blessed and broken, you are enough. Oh, I savor the blessed, cower at the broken, and pray to be enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sister. Geez, you have given us much, much to think about and to reflect on. And I hope that we're going to carry these conversations on with others that we encounter along the way, as you've suggested. And because of that, I am sure that you will be back in the future sometime. And we will do that. It's a challenge to do what you call us to do even today, to breathe and how to breathe, because it's something we're very aware of in our society at this moment with a mask on, and where are we breathing, how are we breathing, and to do it for the sake of our souls, I think that's crucial. So thank you.